Okay, lots of panic about this idea of quilting. First of all, let me reassure you that you do not have to do free motion quilting. This doesn't have to be the biggest challenge of your life. You can do basic, simple, wiggly lines. It's not essential that you do free motion quilting. I free motion because I love to free motion. So I'm not a lifetime quilter, so I don't know all there is to know about quilting, but I can tell you what I have learned and what I know. Now, if I'm just doing simple wiggly lines, I will use my ordinary foot. So either a metal standard foot, or my preferred is a Teflon foot, but that's only because I tend to sew with faux leather quite a lot. I have a Teflon foot on my machine and I tend to keep it on my machine. I don't think using a Teflon foot makes quilting any easier or any better. It's just to let you know that actually there's very little difference between these two, other than the fact that the Teflon foot will skid across faux leather. And if I'm quilting on faux leather, which I do with great regularity, then I would always use a Teflon foot. This project is not designed to be sewn in faux leather, and whilst I think it probably could be if you were really brave, it wouldn't make it an easy project to do. So your standard ordinary sewing foot. Now my machine is a straight stitch only machine, so the gap in between the two prongs on my foot is very narrow, because it doesn't need to be wide enough to do a zigzag, because my machine doesn't do a zigzag. My needle also doesn't move to the left or right, it just stays central, so the gap in the middle of my foot is in one place because that's where the needle goes through. The same applies to my Teflon foot. So that's my standard sewing foot. Your standard sewing foot may look like this. It may have a slightly wider gap in the middle if your machine does a zigzag, or if you can move your needle left to right. So I'm just going to pop those out of the way. The other option is one of these. It's a walking foot. Now, this is the walking foot that's designed for my machine, and whilst it does the trick, it is huge. It's enormous. It's like the size of a small car. I drive a Fiat 500 and this is about the same size. I also think it sounds like a train when it's on, because there's a lot of clackety clackety clack. Now the benefits of one of these is that it will feed the fabric through on the top as well as on the bottom, and I'll show you a bit about that in a second. Now, if you wanted to do free motion quilting, you would need a different sort of foot. You would also need the ability to lower the feed dogs on your sewing machine. Now, I have a little button, a little knob on the side of my machine that allows me to do that. If you can't do that on your machine, and not all machines can, you will often get something, a little sort of a square or rectangular plate with a hole in the middle that comes with your various feet, and a lot of people have them and don't even know what they are. It's a darning plate, and it fits just, if I lift my foot up, it will fit over the top of your feed dog, so that the feed dogs no longer push the fabric through underneath, which allows you to be able to move the fabric around if you're free motion quilting. My machine came with two different free motion quilting feet. They're both the same, but one's just slightly larger on the bottom than the other. My free motion quilting foot is sprung, which means it bounces as it goes. It's not an essential. This is just the foot that came with my machine and I love it. It's not an essential to have a sprung one. On my vintage Elna machines, which don't have that facility, they have a darning plate that goes over the feed dogs, and I have a darning foot, which is just a simple foot with a hole in the bottom. You can also buy an open toe foot, which basically is the same, but it's got a gap at the front of that little circle bit. Let me just move that there. So that little circle bit has a sort of a gap at the front. It means it's easier to see where you're going if you're free motion quilting. You will not need either of these if you're just going to do very basic quilting. So let's look at the basic quilting. Let's look at quilt first. What does the word quilt mean? It means sandwich. So it's basically a piece of fabric on the back, a piece of fabric on the front, and something in the middle. So this is your bread, and the stuff in the middle is your peanut butter and jelly, or peanut butter and jam, or Marmite, or whatever is your sandwich filling of choice. Now for this project, I've been using headliner foam, which is approximately 2 to 3 millimeters thick. You could use Styleville or any of the preparatory bag making foams. Foam will give this more structure. If you try and use batting or wadding, which is what most quilters would use, it won't have the same kind of standy uppiness. Now this is a basic wadding or batting. It depends whether you're in America or the UK. We tend to call it wadding. In America they call it batting. In the quilting world we tend to call it batting. And this is a basic simple polyester, very, very cheap. I think this is a 2-ounce batting, so it's probably about 5 or 6 millimeters thick. But you can see you can screw it up really quite small. It will come back, but it doesn't give a great deal of structure, whereas the foam will give structure to your boxes. We are quilting, but we're also quilting something that we want structure to. You wouldn't have a structure on a quilt that you throw on your bed. You'd have a bit of thickness for warmth, but you wouldn't want it to stand up. You'd want it to sort of mould itself around your body. So I've made my sandwich, and I use a little bit of spray adhesive on either side of the foam to attach my fabric. Just not a lot, just a little bit, just to make sure that it's not slipping and sliding. Some people don't like using spray adhesive, and some people would prefer to use the sort of long quilting pins. Look at the state of those. They're all bent. All of my quilting pins are bent. And just pin the layers together so they don't shift. And you can do whichever suits you best. I prefer to use the spray adhesive because I tend to forget where pins are and I'll stab myself and then bleed on my work. Now I've put pink thread in here. I wouldn't usually use pink thread. I've tried to find a lightish coloured fabric and a bright coloured thread so that you can see what I'm doing. So let's start with the basic. And the basic idea is, if you have never done this before, if you've never quilted before, this is the easiest way to do it. So set your stitch length at about 3.5-ish and just stitch a wiggly line. It doesn't have to be fancy, doesn't have to be clever. I do tend to try and stitch all the way, always from the same end. It will stop your fabric warping at all. Now, I haven't interfaced either of these fabrics on this piece of foam. For our prap caddies, you will be interfacing, which will give your caddies just a little bit more structure. You can see it just looks fab, and it's really simple to do. You've got exactly the same on the back. That will need a bit of a press because I don't think I've adhered that quite as well as I should do, but your quilting is on both sides and looks fabulous. So that is your basic wiggly line quilting, and I don't believe that any of you can't do that. I know I had one lady that mentioned she was just learning to do straight lines. Forget about straight lines. You don't need straight lines if you do it like this. You can just do wiggly lines. It actually looks really effective. If you wanted to, you could then go and do wiggly lines across the other way. Let's just do a few more of those. This part is really your choice. You can make it as complicated or as simple as you want for yourself. we go, look. It's really simple to do, just wiggly lines. You don't have to do straight lines. However, if you want to do straight lines or cross hatching, it's always better if you actually can measure somehow. Now, some machines have a little bit that pokes out the side of a walking foot, or even an ordinary foot. They can put a guide on the side. It's like a little piece of metal that comes out with a sort of a foot on it, and that little bit on the side is actually, you put it on your previous line of stitching, and it means that your next line of stitching will be a measured way, a sort of a distance from that first line of stitching, and then you would continue to move across your quilting, making sure that that little marker sits in the previous line of stitching, which will give you even lines. If, however, you don't have one of those, and I don't, you can use a triangular ruler and a marker. So I'm going to do 1, 2 lines. I'm just going to pop that out of the way. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do those 2 lines of stitching first. And these are just straight lines that I've marked with a chalk marker, which will rub off. And I'm just literally going to stitch over those marks that I've made. And then once you've done your first straight lines, you can then use your ruler to mark, turn it over, that's better. To mark your next lines so that they're all equidistant and at the same angle. And stitch on the marks that you've made. I'm doing this quite quickly, so I'm not being quite as accurate as I perhaps should be. Once you've done that line, mark another line. Oops, let's just put that down there. And you can kind of see where we're going with this now. And you will create a sort of diamond effect. And you can have your lines as close or as far away as you want, or you can even change, have them 1 inch and then ½ inch, whatever you want really. There is no, I'm not going to be prescriptive about how you quilt. It's about you having fun with it. And the reason that we quilt the panels together is so that they stay sturdy and so that they stay together. And the quilting also gives this some structure. So you can see there we've got the sort of diamond type fashion idea. You could do squares, you can do diamonds, you can do whatever you want to. Now I'm going to take that foot off. And what did I do with, oh, there it is. I'm going to put my free motion foot back on. Bring up my thread from the bottom. and I'm going to lower my feed dogs. Now my machine has the facility to do that, and I'm going to literally quilt from one side to the other. Now when you're free motion quilting, you are the person who has to move the fabric. I'm just going to try and show you what not to do. Now you can see that I'm speeding up and slowing down, and I will show you what that does in just a second. Now I've created my curvy line in exactly the same way as we did at the other end. So we've got curvy lines there that we did with our foot on. This is free motioned. Now I'm not sure if you can see this, but these stitches where I started are all pretty much the same length. Then when I speed up, I don't know if you can see that actually, those, you probably can, those stitches are very, very small and very close together, and they don't look nearly as tidy as the nice even stitches. And therein is the main problem that most people have with free motion quilting, is getting a nice even stitch. And it's about the correlation between how quickly you move your fabric and how quickly you have your needle going in and out. And it's a bit like driving. You need to have a nice even speed to get a nice even stitch. Now, you can do just about anything free motion quilting. The feed dogs are no longer pushing the fabric through. So I can take my hands off, no hands, and you can see my needle's going up and down, but my fabric's not going anywhere. I need to use my hands to move my fabric. And it's your hands that will create the design. Now, because this is small, I would normally use quilting gloves. So when I say quilting gloves, they're not quilting gloves. They're from the local B&Q, and they're gardening gloves that are fabric, but they have, I don't know if I've got a pair here. Don't think, oh yes I have. They're a gardening glove, a cotton gardening glove, but they've got this grippy stuff on the front. So if I was doing a bigger project, I would put one of these gloves on, and it allows me, in fact I put two on, to hold my fabric, and that will grip onto my fabric and allow my fabric to move. Because this is only a small piece of fabric, I actually don't need that because it's not too heavy and move easily. And you can kind of go in any direction you want to. You can hear the thud of the machine is nice and even, and the speed at which I move my fabric is nice and even. And all I'm doing here is little circles, nothing fancy. What you have to remember is that you have one continuous line of stitching. You can go back over a previous line of stitching to get to the place where you want to be, but it's one continuous line of stitching. It's quite useful to practice with a piece of paper and a pencil, not taking your pencil off of the paper to create a design, because that's effectively what you're doing. You're going to be drawing with thread. Now, I know that I make this look a lot easier than it actually is, and I know that not everybody can do this. I only free motion quilted for the first time about 3.5 years ago. There, you can see that's just free motion quilted. And you can get as fancy or as clever with the design as your artistic creation, as artistic as you want to be. You don't have to be able to draw. People say to me, oh, you have to be able to draw to free motion quilt. That's a load of cobblers. Little circles, anybody can draw a circle. You don't need to be able to draw. Right, let me just grab a piece of paper. If you take a pencil and put your pencil on the paper and don't take your pencil off of the paper. You can go back over your lines, but you don't take your pencil off of the paper. You get an idea of how you're going to create your free motion quilting design. I'm doing this on top of the quilt, which is not ideal. And you can see I've created the same thing on paper with a pencil, and that's how you're going to use your machine to create a free motion quilted design. Now, the one thing that a lot of people talk about is feathers. So I'm going to show you how I create a feather. The feathers are hot boxes. The feathers are this bit in here, which people love. You see it so often, and people say, I don't know how to do a feather. I'll show you on paper how I do a feather. So I would start at the bottom and I would go and do a wiggly windy line. Again, I'm not taking my pencil off the paper. Let's just come back down the wiggly windy line. And when we get to the bottom, on one side, I'm going to do half of a love heart. And then I'm going to go back up that central line, come out and do a slightly bigger half of a love heart, come back up on that line, back to the centre, this is how I do them. There are lots and lots of ways of doing them. So for some of that, you're going to be sort of backtracking on your own stitching, and that in itself is actually not as easy as it sounds. It takes a little bit of practice. Now, there are some people that just have a natural aptitude to this. I believe I was one of those lucky people. The first time I was introduced to free motion quilting was by somebody who was a very good quilter, who said, give it a go. She made me a little sandwich with some fabric and some wadding, and I drew a picture, and she almost fell over. It's not as easy as I sometimes make it look, and I'm aware that it's not as easy as I sometimes make it look. But so once I've got to the top, I would come all the way back down my line, and then I would do the same thing on the other side. So we start with half of a love heart, going back over the stitching I've already done. I actually stitch better than I draw, it would appear. So you can see how that's building up into that feather, and that's exactly how you would stitch. You would not take your needle out, you would continue on one continuous line of stitching, and you will end up with the same pattern on the back as you have on the front. And let's just take this and let me show you when I'm stitching it. So I'm going to start at the bottom, so I'm going to do a sort of a wiggly line up to the top, and I'm going to come carefully back down my line, and this is the stem. Let me just, the stem of your feather. I have my one half of a love heart. I'm trying to do this slowly because I usually free motion quilt quite quickly. So we've done our second part of our love heart and coming back along that outside line. And then doing the next sort of part of my feather up the central line. Back over my line to the point where I want to come back in again. But this isn't essential. You do not have to free motion quilt. If you want to have a go, there is a video in the main group that I put up yesterday or the day before, after a bit of excitement when I put the video of my free motion quilting, that gives you a lot of this information. But I don't want anybody worrying about this. The quilting does not have to be really fancy. It can be as simple or as fancy as you feel comfortable with. Now the sample that I use in the videos, I've just done a few curvy lines and a little bit of free motion quilting. So there we go, we've got right to the top. Coming back down that central spine. And you know, I'm finding it really difficult to talk and do this at the same time, because normally I just kind of get myself in the zone and quilt. I'm also finding it quite difficult to do it slowly. For those of you that are quilters, quilting on foam feels slightly different to quilting on batting. And it does take a little bit of getting used to. You may find you need a slightly larger needle because you're going through quite a lot of thickness, and because foam is denser than most battings or waddings, even the thicker ones. I would also advise you put a nice new needle in for this. For any quilting, whether you're doing free motion or you're going to just do the wigglies. Now I wouldn't normally just cut my threads off. I would normally pull my threads up to the top so that I can tie them off and bury them, but because this is just a sample piece, I'm just going to cut my threads off. And you can see there we have a feather. It's not my greatest feather, but it's not a bad feather. And on the back we still have a feather. So whatever you do on the front, you're also going to get on the back. It's not terrifying. Please don't be terrified. Let me just, oh, here we go. Let me show you this one. Now this one was the initial crap caddy that I did when I was sort of practicing measurements and stuff like that. And I think you can see there, that's just got wiggly lines. It hasn't got anything fancy. I did a few bits of sort of large circles on the sides. But for the most part, it's just, to catch it in the light to see the lines, but it's just wiggly lines. And it looks just as good, it looks just as effective with just the wiggly lines. So please don't worry and think, oh my goodness, I've got to do all that fancy stuff that she did. Because yes, this is fancy stuff, but yes, this is because I like doing it and because I am a bit of a show off. It makes absolutely no difference to the finished effect, other than the fact that one's a bit fancier than the other. But it doesn't stop its functionality, it doesn't do anything. The quilting does help to give this whole thing structure though, so you do really need to do quilting. If you absolutely feel like you can't, then actually you really don't have to if you don't want to. You could just, when you see the pattern, you'll understand how this is constructed, but you'll have this quilt sandwich. You could just cut the pattern piece out from the quilt sandwich without having done any quilting at all, and baste around the outside, and the three pieces will then be attached together, and you carry on with construction. However, if you do that, this lining is likely to sort of sit a bit saggy. So quilting it keeps it all nice and tightly together, so you don't get any kind of saggy bits on it. So there we go. That's a little bit about quilting. Have a practice. If you're worried about it, grab yourself a couple of bits. I mean, this is an Aldi fat quarters. These are not, I mean, that's literally half of an Aldi fat quarter on the front, half on the back. Stick some foam inside of it and have a play. But please don't be terrified. Please don't be frightened. As little or as much as you feel comfortable with, because that's what this isn't about, putting the fear of God into you. It's about creating something to give to somebody else that they're going to love, and they will love them, because everybody loves to be given something that's been made for them. So I hope that clarifies a few things. So you can use either a standard foot, a Teflon foot, which I like to use, or a standard foot. You can use a walking foot if you really want to. And the benefit of the walking foot is, now if you're using an ordinary foot, I like to release the foot pressure on my machine. If I'm using an ordinary foot, if I have it down too hard, as it pulls across, it will push. Now I can probably do that with my fingernail, but it will push the fabric, even if it's been stuck down, and you'll end up with puckers. Now I've managed to do that with my fingernail, but you'll end up with little puckers in the fabric if the foot pressure is really high. So if it's pushed right down, your foot, even a Teflon foot, will pucker the fabric. Now the benefit of one of these is that it has feed dogs on the bottom on your machine, but it also has feed dogs on the walking foot. So you'll have feed dogs on the top and the bottom, which means it will feed the fabric through on the top and you will not get any puckers. So if you're worried about puckering and you have a walking foot, then probably good to use it, whether you're doing straight lines or whether you're doing wiggly lines. I just personally can't get on with it because it's so big. For me, it's a personal preference. So there we go. Ordinary feet, a sprung quilting foot, or indeed a darning foot or an open toe embroidery foot. You need to lower your feed dogs or put a cover over the top. Now the other thing is that you ideally need to turn your stitch length to 0 if you're free motion quilting. Now I don't, because my machine doesn't seem to be bothered whether it's on 0 or otherwise, but most machines, if I'm using my this foot comes from a vintage Elna, and if I'm using the vintage Elna with the darning plate over the feed dogs, I do have to reduce my stitch length to 0. It doesn't work very easily if I don't do it. On my Juki, I don't need to do it. It's just I think the machine has its own little mind. But that's the other thing that you would normally do. So there we go. A little bit about quilting. I hope that none of you are getting too frightened about it. If you're worried, give it a try. Just have a practice. You know, what's the worst that can happen? Just a piece of Aldi's fat quarter, something that's not important, and use a bright coloured thread for your practice, so you can kind of examine your stitches. Now it's very difficult to see, but as I say, those stitches there are really close together. These stitches here are nice and even. The stitches where you use your ordinary foot are all nice and even, but you can see, as the light catches it, you can see how cool that quilting looks. It's good, isn't it? But be as adventurous as you want to be, as you feel comfortable being. Don't feel pressured to do something that's way beyond your skill level.